Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent their weekends at the mall or dating, she was at the local gym, pushing herself through grueling workouts that would make grown men quit. Her father, a former Army veteran, had taught her that strength wasn't just about muscles. It was about mental toughness, discipline, and the ability to push through when everything in your body screamed to stop. Growing up in a household where military values were deeply ingrained, Sarah learned early that respect was earned, not given. Her father would wake her at 5 in the morning for runs around their neighborhood, teaching her that excellence wasn't optional. It was a way of life. He never went easy on her because she was a girl. If anything, he pushed her harder, knowing the world would test her in ways that would break the unprepared. When Sarah announced her intention to join the Marines after high school, her mother cried. Not from pride, though that was there too, but from fear. She knew her daughter was tough, but the Marines were legendary for breaking even the strongest recruits. Her father, however, smiled with a mixture of pride and concern. He knew Sarah had what it took, but he also knew the Corps would test every fiber of her being. The decision hadn't come lightly. Sarah had watched countless documentaries about Marine training, read memoirs of female Marines who had fought for their place in an overwhelmingly male institution. She understood the challenges she would face, but something deep inside her burned with the need to prove herself worthy of the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor. Her high school friends thought she was crazy. Why would someone choose the hardest branch of the military when she could go to college on a scholarship? Sarah was smart enough for any university, athletic enough for sports scholarships, but none of that appealed to her. She wanted something that would forge her into the strongest version of herself possible. The months leading up to her departure for boot camp were filled with intense preparation. Sarah increased her workout routine, focusing on the physical standards she would need to meet and exceed. She studied Marine Corps history, memorized the 11 general orders, and practiced military bearing in front of her bedroom mirror. Her father helped her prepare mentally, sharing stories from his own military experience while being careful not to reveal too much about what lay ahead. On the morning of her departure for Parris Island, South Carolina, Sarah stood in her childhood bedroom one last time. The walls were covered with motivational quotes, pictures from high school track meets, and a single Marine Corps recruiting poster that had inspired her decision. She packed light, knowing that most of her personal belongings would be irrelevant in the world she was about to enter. The bus ride to the airport was quiet. Her parents accompanied her, each lost in their own thoughts about what the next 13 weeks would bring. Her father occasionally glanced at her with a look that mixed pride with protective concern. Her mother held her hand tightly, as if trying to memorize the feeling before letting her daughter go into a world she couldn't follow her into. At the airport, the goodbye was harder than Sarah had anticipated. Seeing her parents' faces, understanding that she was choosing to leave everything familiar behind for an unknown challenge, made her question her decision for just a moment. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by the burning determination that had brought her this far. The flight to South Carolina was filled with other young recruits, most of them male, all of them trying to project confidence while battling their own fears. Sarah sat quietly, observing her future fellow Marines, wondering which ones would make it through the trials ahead and which would find themselves on buses home within the first few weeks. As the plane descended toward Charleston, Sarah could see the flat, humid landscape that would become her temporary home. Parris Island sat like a fortress in the South Carolina Lowcountry, its reputation preceding it like a storm front. This was where boys and girls came to be transformed into Marines, where civilians died and warriors were born. The moment the recruits stepped off the bus at Parris Island, their civilian lives officially ended. The yellow footprints painted on the asphalt became their first lesson in Marine Corps precision and uniformity. Sarah placed her feet exactly on the prints, feeling the weight of tradition and expectation settling on her shoulders like a heavy pack. The receiving process was a blur of shouting, paperwork, and controlled chaos designed to strip away civilian comfort and begin the psychological transformation. Sarah's long hair, which she had worn proudly throughout high school, fell to the floor in dark waves as the base barbers worked with mechanical efficiency. Looking in the mirror afterward, she saw a stranger staring back, someone who already looked more serious, more focused. The first night in the squad bay was unlike anything she had experienced. Surrounded by dozens of other recruits, all trying to process the magnitude of what they had signed up for, Sarah lay on her narrow rack staring at the ceiling. The drill instructor's voices still echoed in her ears from the initial processing, their words designed to break down every assumption about personal worth and capability. Some recruits were already crying quietly in their racks, overwhelmed by the reality of their situation. Others, like Sarah, lay silently planning and preparing mentally for the challenges ahead. She thought about her father's words during their last conversation. The Corps will test everything you think you know about yourself. When that happens, remember who you really are. As the lights went out and the squad bay fell into an uneasy silence, Sarah felt both fear and excitement coursing through her veins. Tomorrow would bring her first full day as a Marine recruit, and she knew it would be unlike anything she had ever experienced. The drill instructors had made it clear that they would push every recruit to their breaking point and beyond, looking for those who had what it took to earn the title Marine. Sarah closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing and centering herself for the battles ahead. She had no idea that in just a few days, one moment would test everything she believed about herself and change the course of her entire Marine Corps experience. The foundation was being laid for a confrontation that would either break her completely or forge her into something stronger than she had ever imagined possible. The first week at Paris Island passed in a haze of constant activity, shouting, and physical exhaustion that pushed every recruit to their limits. Sarah quickly learned that her high school athletic training, while helpful, had only scratched the surface of what real military conditioning demanded. The drill instructors seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to find weaknesses and exploit them with surgical precision. Drill Instructor Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez commanded 3rd Platoon with an iron fist wrapped in controlled fury. A career Marine with 3 combat deployments, he had earned his position through years of exemplary service and an unwavering commitment to producing the finest Marines possible. Rodriguez stood just under 6 feet tall, but his presence filled any room he entered. His voice could cut through chaos or reduce a cocky recruit to tears with equal effectiveness. From the moment Rodriguez first laid eyes on Sarah, something about her triggered his attention. Perhaps it was the way she held herself with quiet confidence while other recruits trembled, or maybe it was how she met his gaze directly when he addressed the platoon. Whatever it was, Rodriguez made a mental note that this recruit would require special attention to either forge into an exceptional Marine or break completely in the attempt. The daily routine at Paris Island was designed to overwhelm and transform. Recruits woke to the sound of metal trash cans crashing at 4:30 in the morning, followed by precisely timed personal hygiene, rack making that had to meet impossibly high standards, and uniform preparation that could take hours to perfect. Every action was scrutinized, every mistake amplified and corrected with physical training that left recruits gasping and questioning their life choices. Sarah excelled in many areas but struggled with others that seemed arbitrary to her civilian mindset. The particular way socks had to be folded, the exact angle of items in her footlocker, the precise positioning of her cover on her head. These details seemed meaningless, but were treated as matters of life and death by the drill instructors. She began to understand that this wasn't really about socks or footlockers. It was about attention to detail, following orders without question, and accepting that in the military, there was a right way, a wrong way, and the Marine way. During physical training sessions, Sarah's natural athleticism began to show. She consistently scored among the top performers in her platoon for sit-ups, pull-ups, and the 3-mile run. Her competitive spirit, which had served her well in high school sports, drove her to push harder when others began to fade. This excellence, however, came with a price that she didn't initially understand. Rodriguez watched Sarah's performances with growing interest and something that might have been concern. In his experience, recruits who excelled too easily often lacked the humility necessary to become truly great Marines. Natural talent was valuable, but it could also become a weakness if it prevented someone from understanding their own limitations and the importance of teamwork over individual achievement. The other recruits in the platoon began to notice Sarah's consistent high performance, and reactions were mixed. Some looked up to her as an example of what was possible, while others resented her apparent ease with challenges that left them struggling. The dynamics in the squad bay became complex as personalities emerged, despite the drill instructor's efforts to strip away individual identity in favor of unit cohesion. During one particularly grueling physical training session, Sarah finished a timed obstacle course nearly 30 seconds ahead of the next closest recruit. As she stood catching her breath, she noticed Rodriguez approaching with an expression she couldn't quite read. The other recruits were still struggling through various obstacles, some falling repeatedly as they tried to navigate challenges that seemed designed to humble rather than simply test. Rodriguez stopped directly in front of Sarah, his presence commanding even in the midst of the training chaos around them. For a long moment he simply studied her, taking in her controlled breathing, her attentive posture, and the way she maintained military bearing even while exhausted. Other drill instructors continued to motivate struggling recruits with colorful language and creative physical training exercises. "Martinez," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying clearly despite the noise around them. "You think you're pretty hot stuff, don't you?" The question carried layers of meaning that Sarah tried to decipher quickly. She had learned that drill instructor questions were rarely as simple as they appeared, and the wrong answer could result in consequences that affected not just her, but potentially her entire platoon. She considered her response carefully, knowing that both false modesty and obvious pride could be equally dangerous. "Sir, this recruit is doing her best to meet the Marine Corps standards, sir," Sarah replied, maintaining the required speaking format that had been drilled into them from day one. Rodriguez circled her slowly, like a predator evaluating prey. The other recruits who had finished the obstacle course watched nervously, recognizing the signs of a drill instructor who was building toward something significant. The air seemed to thicken with tension as Rodriguez completed his circle and stopped directly in front of Sarah again. "Your best?" Rodriguez repeated, his voice taking on a tone that made several nearby recruits involuntarily step back. "Your best is making your fellow recruits look like failures? Your best is showing off instead of helping your team succeed?" Sarah felt confusion wash over her. She had been taught her entire life to excel, to push herself to be the best she could be. Her father had never accepted anything less than her maximum effort, and she had assumed the Marines would want the same. The idea that her performance could be seen as detrimental to the group was a concept she hadn't considered. "Sir, this recruit understands, sir," she responded, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was supposed to understand. Rodriguez stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could smell the starch in his uniform and see the intensity in his eyes. "No, Martinez, I don't think you understand anything yet. You think this is about you. You think this is about proving how tough you are, how fast you can run, how many pull-ups you can do." The drill instructor's voice began to rise, attracting the attention of recruits throughout the training area. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her as Rodriguez continued his verbal assault, each word delivered with the precision of someone who had perfected the art of breaking down civilian egos. "Let me tell you what this is really about, recruit. This is about learning that you are nothing without the Marines next to you. This is about understanding that your individual success means nothing if your unit fails. This is about discovering that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is help someone else succeed instead of showing everyone how great you think you are." Sarah felt her face burning with a combination of embarrassment and anger. She had been giving everything she had, pushing herself exactly as she had been taught, and now she was being criticized for it. The unfairness of the situation made her want to defend herself, to explain that she was only doing what she thought was expected, but she forced herself to remain silent and maintain military bearing. Rodriguez seemed to sense her internal struggle, and his expression shifted slightly. For just a moment, something that might have been understanding flickered in his eyes, before the hard mask of a drill instructor returned. He was building toward something, Sarah realized, but she had no idea what was coming or how to prepare for it. The tension between Sarah and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez continued to build over the following days like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Every interaction seemed charged with unspoken challenge, each training evolution becoming a test of wills disguised as routine instruction. Sarah found herself walking a tightrope between excellence and the accusation of showing off, trying to perform well enough to meet standards while not outshining her fellow recruits too dramatically. The other members of 3rd Platoon began to notice the special attention Sarah was receiving from Rodriguez, Some whispered that she was being singled out because she was female. Others speculated that her consistent high performance had marked her as a threat to the drill instructor's authority. The truth was more complex than any of them realized, rooted in Rodriguez's extensive experience with recruits who possessed natural talent but lacked the deeper understanding of what it meant to be a Marine. During a particularly challenging day of close-order drill, the platoon struggled to master the intricate movements that required perfect coordination and timing. Close-order drill was more than just marching. It was a demonstration of unity, precision, and the ability to function as a single entity rather than a collection of individuals. Rodriguez watched with growing frustration as recruits stumbled through movements they had practiced dozens of times. Sarah found herself naturally falling into the rhythm of the drill commands, her body responding to the cadence with an ease that came from years of athletic training and natural coordination. She moved with precision while recruits around her struggled to keep pace, creating a visual discord that made the entire platoon look unpolished. Rodriguez's jaw tightened as he observed the disparity, seeing not just individual performance but the breakdown of unit cohesion. As the drill session continued, Rodriguez's commands became sharper, his corrections more pointed. He singled out recruits who were struggling, making them repeat movements until their legs shook with fatigue. The South Carolina heat beat down mercilessly on the asphalt parade deck, creating waves of heat that made the black pavement shimmer like water. "Martinez," Rodriguez's voice cut through the humid air like a blade. "Front and center." Sarah broke from formation and double-timed to a position directly in front of the drill instructor, snapping to attention with practiced precision. Around her, the rest of the platoon remained frozen in formation, but she could feel their eyes on her, some sympathetic, others resentful of the attention she seemed to constantly attract. Rodriguez began to circle her slowly, his footsteps echoing against the buildings that surrounded the parade deck. The sound seemed amplified in the humid air, creating a rhythm that matched Sarah's heartbeat as adrenaline began to course through her system. She had no idea what was coming, but experience had taught her that when a drill instructor singled someone out like this, it rarely ended well for the recruit involved. "You think you're better than your fellow recruits, don't you, Martinez?" Rodriguez's voice was deceptively calm, but Sarah had learned to recognize the warning signs of an approaching storm. The other drill instructors had stopped their activities and were watching with interest, recognizing that something significant was about to unfold. "Sir, no sir," Sarah responded automatically, though part of her wondered if her actions had somehow conveyed the opposite message despite her intentions. Rodriguez stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the sweat stains on his utility uniform and the intensity burning in his dark eyes. "No? Then why do you keep making your fellow Marines look like idiots? Why do you keep showing off instead of helping your team succeed?" The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been trying her hardest to do everything right, to meet the impossibly high standards that seemed to change daily. And now she was being criticized for succeeding. The unfairness of it made anger bloom in her chest, but she forced herself to maintain military bearing and keep her voice controlled. "Sir, this recruit is trying to do her best, sir." "Your best?" Rodriguez's voice began to rise, attracting the attention of recruits from other platoons who were training nearby. "Your best is making the Marines next to you look weak? Your best is caring more about your own performance than the success of your unit?" Sarah felt confusion and anger warring in her mind. Everything she had been taught about military service emphasized excellence, pushing beyond limits and never accepting mediocrity. Her father had drilled into her that half measures were unacceptable, that she should always strive to be better than she was the day before. Now she was being told that this very mentality was wrong, that her success was somehow harming her fellow recruits. Rodriguez seemed to sense her internal struggle, and his approach shifted. Instead of continuing the verbal assault, he stepped back slightly and lowered his voice just enough that the other recruits had to strain to hear his words. "You want to know what real strength looks like, Martinez? Real strength is lifting up the people around you. Real strength is making your team better, not just making yourself look good. Real strength is understanding that in combat, the Marine next to you is more important than your own ego." The words hit Sarah with unexpected force. She began to understand that this wasn't really about drill movements or physical training scores. This was about something deeper, something that went to the core of what it meant to be a Marine. Rodriguez wasn't just criticizing her performance, he was challenging her entire understanding of what strength and excellence really meant. "Sir, this recruit understands." "Sir?" Sarah replied, and for the first time, she meant it. Rodriguez studied her face for a long moment, searching for signs that his message was truly getting through. What he saw seemed to satisfy him partially, but Sarah could tell that he wasn't finished with her yet. This was just the beginning of a lesson that would continue until she either fully understood or broke under the pressure. "Do you, Martinez? Do you really understand? Because I'm not seeing it in your actions. I'm seeing a recruit who thinks this is all about her, who thinks being a Marine means being better than everyone else instead of being part of something bigger than herself." Rodriguez turned to address the entire platoon, his voice carrying clearly across the parade deck. "Listen up, recruits. Martinez here is going to demonstrate what real teamwork looks like. She's going to show you what happens when someone learns that individual excellence means nothing without unit cohesion." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized that whatever was about to happen, she was going to be the example. Rodriguez was setting her up for something that would either teach her the lesson he was trying to convey or break her spirit completely. The other recruits shifted nervously in formation, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. Rodriguez stepped close to Sarah again, his voice dropping to a level that only she could hear. "You think you're tough, Martinez? You think you understand what strength really means? Let's find out." The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt every muscle in her body tense in response. She had no idea what test Rodriguez was about to put her through, but she knew that everything she thought she understood about herself was about to be challenged in ways she couldn't imagine. The morning of the incident dawned oppressively humid, with thick clouds hanging low over Paris Island like a gray blanket that trapped the heat and moisture close to the ground. 3rd Platoon had been awakened earlier than usual for what Rodriguez announced would be a comprehensive training evaluation, covering everything they had learned in their first month of boot camp. Sarah felt the familiar knot of nervous energy in her stomach as she prepared for the day. The past week had been filled with increasingly intense interactions with Rodriguez, each one building towards something she couldn't quite identify, but knew was significant. The other recruits had begun to distance themselves from her slightly, not out of malice but from the practical understanding that being too close to someone who attracted drill, instructor attention could result in unwanted scrutiny. The training evolution began before dawn with a forced march carrying full packs across the island's challenging terrain. Sarah found her rhythm quickly, her conditioning serving her well as they navigated sandy paths, wooden bridges over marshes, and the uneven ground that characterized the South Carolina lowcountry. Rodriguez moved alongside the platoon like a predator monitoring his prey, his eyes constantly scanning for signs of weakness or failure. As the sun rose higher, the temperature climbed with it, turning the humid air into something that felt almost solid. Sweat soaked through uniforms despite the early hour, and several recruits began to show signs of heat exhaustion that required careful monitoring from the drill instructors. Rodriguez pushed the pace relentlessly, testing not just physical conditioning but mental toughness and the ability to continue functioning when everything hurt. The march concluded at a training area that had been set up with various obstacles and challenges, designed to test different aspects of Marine Corps skills. Combat conditioning, weapons handling, tactical movement, and team-based problem-solving would all be evaluated throughout the day. Rodriguez gathered the platoon around him as he explained the standards and expectations for each evolution. "Today you prove whether you have what it takes to call yourself Marines," Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying clearly despite the ambient noise of other training activities happening throughout the area. "Some of you will succeed, some of you will fail, some of you will discover that everything you thought you knew about yourself was wrong." Sarah felt his eyes linger on her as he spoke those last words, and she knew with absolute certainty that whatever was coming would involve her directly. The anticipation was almost worse than any physical challenge could be, building pressure in her chest that made it difficult to breathe normally. The morning progressed through various training stations, each one designed to push recruits to their limits while evaluating their performance under stress. Sarah excelled at most challenges, but she could see Rodriguez watching her constantly, taking notes on a clipboard that never left his hands. The attention made her self-conscious in a way that affected her performance, creating a feedback loop of pressure that continued to build throughout the morning. During a particularly challenging obstacle course run, one of Sarah's fellow recruits, a young man named Johnson from rural Alabama, struggled severely with an obstacle that required upper body strength he simply didn't possess. Sarah watched him fail repeatedly, his arms shaking with exhaustion as he tried unsuccessfully to complete a rope climb that was preventing him from finishing the course within the required time limit. Without thinking, Sarah moved to help Johnson, offering encouragement and practical advice based on her own experience with similar challenges. She demonstrated technique, helped him position his body correctly, and stayed with him until he successfully completed the obstacle. The assistance cost Sarah valuable time on her own run, but seeing Johnson succeed felt more important than her individual performance. Rodriguez observed this interaction with intense interest, making additional notes on his clipboard. When the evolution concluded, he called both Sarah and Johnson to report to him separately from the rest of the platoon. Johnson, still breathing heavily from his exertion, looked nervous about the individual attention from the senior drill instructor. "Johnson," Rodriguez began, his voice surprisingly mild, "how did you feel about Martinez helping you complete that obstacle?" Johnson glanced quickly at Sarah before responding. "Sir, this recruit was grateful for the assistance, sir." "This recruit could not have completed the evolution without help, sir." Rodriguez nodded slowly, then turned his attention to Sarah. "And you, Martinez, why did you choose to help Johnson, instead of focusing on your own performance?" The question felt loaded with meaning that Sarah couldn't fully decipher. She had acted instinctively, responding to a fellow recruit's struggle without considering the implications for herself. Now she wondered if that had been the right choice or another mistake in Rodriguez's eyes. "Sir, this recruit saw a fellow Marine who needed assistance." "Sir?" Sarah replied, choosing her words carefully. "A fellow Marine?" Rodriguez repeated, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Johnson here hasn't earned that title yet, has he? None of you have. So why risk your own success for someone who might not even make it through training?" The question struck at something fundamental about Sarah's understanding of military service and teamwork. She had been raised to believe that helping others was always the right choice. But Rodriguez seemed to be suggesting that such assistance might be misplaced or even harmful in this environment. "Sir, this recruit believes that Marines take care of each other." "Sir?" Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Johnson shifted nervously beside them, clearly uncomfortable with being part of whatever lesson was unfolding. The heat continued to build around them, creating an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to amplify the tension of the moment. "Interesting philosophy, Martinez," Rodriguez said finally. "Let's see how committed you are to that belief." Without warning, Rodriguez barked orders that assembled the entire platoon in formation around them. The other recruits moved quickly into position, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The drill instructor's sudden shift in demeanor set everyone on edge, creating an electricity in the air that made Sarah's skin prickle with apprehension. Rodriguez positioned himself directly in front of Sarah, close enough that she could see the individual beads of sweat on his forehead and the intensity burning in his dark eyes. The rest of the platoon stood frozen in formation, afraid to move or even breathe too loudly as they waited to see what would unfold. "You want to take care of your fellow Marines, Martinez?" Rodriguez's voice was deceptively calm, but Sarah had learned to recognize the warning signs of an approaching storm. "You think you understand what that means? Let me show you what taking care of Marines really looks like." The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her body automatically shift into a more defensive posture, despite her efforts to maintain proper military bearing. Rodriguez had been building toward this moment for weeks, and she sensed that everything that had happened between them was about to culminate in a confrontation that would either break her completely or forge her into something stronger than she had ever imagined possible. Rodriguez stepped back slightly and assumed a combat stance that Sarah recognized from their limited martial arts training. The message was clear, and Sarah felt her heart rate spike as she realized what was about to happen. This wasn't going to be a verbal lesson or a written test. This was going to be physical, direct, and unlike anything she had experienced in her life. The moment stretched like a taut wire as Rodriguez stood in his combat stance, his eyes locked on Sarah with an intensity that made the humid South Carolina air feel even thicker. The entire platoon held their collective breath, sensing that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as she tried to process what was happening. "You think you understand strength, Martinez?" Rodriguez's voice cut through the silence like a blade. You think you know what it means to protect your fellow Marines? Let's find out. Without another word of warning, Rodriguez moved forward with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years perfecting combat techniques. His intention wasn't to seriously injure Sarah, but to create a moment of truth that would either break her civilian mindset completely or forge her into the type of Marine he believed she could become. Sarah barely had time to react as Rodriguez closed the distance between them. Her athletic background kicked in instinctively, her body moving to defend itself even as her mind struggled to comprehend that a drill instructor was actually engaging her in physical combat. The training area around them seemed to fade away as all of her focus narrowed to the immediate threat in front of her. Rodriguez's first move was a controlled takedown designed to put Sarah on the ground quickly and decisively. He used her own momentum against her, stepping aside at the last moment and using a combination of leverage and technique that sent her tumbling to the sandy ground with enough force to knock the wind from her lungs. The impact was jarring, sending shockwaves through her body that left her momentarily stunned. The recruits watching gasped collectively as they saw their fellow trainee hit the ground hard. Some looked away, unable to watch what seemed like an unfair confrontation between a seasoned combat veteran and a recruit who had been training for only a few weeks. Others stared in fascination, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would define not just Sarah's experience, but their understanding of what the Marine Corps demanded. Sarah lay on the ground for a moment, tasting sand and feeling the burn of scraped skin where she had hit the rough surface. Her ears were ringing slightly from the impact, and every instinct told her to stay down, to submit, to acknowledge that she was outmatched and hope that the lesson would end there. But something deeper, something that had been building throughout her weeks of training, refused to let her quit. Rodriguez stood over her, his expression mixing satisfaction with something that might have been respect. "Stay down, Martinez," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the training area. "You've learned your lesson. You know your place now." But Sarah was already moving, pushing herself up from the sand with determination that surprised even her. Her body ached from the impact. Her uniform was dirty and torn, and she could taste blood from where she had bitten her tongue during the fall. None of that mattered. What mattered was proving to herself, to Rodriguez, and to every recruit watching that she wouldn't be broken by a single moment of adversity. "Sir, this recruit is not finished, sir," Sarah said as she regained her footing, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Rodriguez's eyebrows rose slightly at her response. In his experience, most recruits who found themselves on the ground in a confrontation with a drill instructor stayed there, accepting their defeat and hoping to avoid further punishment. Sarah's decision to get back up changed the dynamic of the entire situation, transforming what could have been a simple lesson in humility into something much more complex. "Not finished?" Rodriguez repeated, circling her like a predator evaluating wounded prey. "You think you have something more to prove, Martinez?" Sarah straightened her shoulders and looked directly at Rodriguez, meeting his gaze with a steadiness that surprised everyone watching, including herself. "Sir, this recruit believes that Marines don't quit, sir." The words hung in the humid air like a challenge, changing the energy of the entire confrontation. Rodriguez had intended to demonstrate Sarah's limitations and teach her about humility, but her response suggested that the lesson might unfold differently than he had planned. The other drill instructors moved closer, recognizing that something significant was happening that might require their intervention. Rodriguez nodded slowly, acknowledging Sarah's response with what might have been approval. "Marines don't quit," he repeated, "but Marines also know when they're outmatched. Marines know when to follow orders and when to admit they need help." Without warning, Rodriguez moved again, this time with more intensity than before. Sarah was better prepared for the attack, but Rodriguez's experience and skill still gave him overwhelming advantages. He feinted left, then moved right, using techniques that Sarah had never encountered to put her back on the ground even more forcefully than before. This time, Sarah hit the sand harder, the impact driving the breath from her lungs and sending stars dancing across her vision. Pain shot through her shoulder where she had landed awkwardly, and for a moment she wondered if something might be seriously injured. The watching recruits winced sympathetically, some of them looking away from what seemed like an increasingly one-sided confrontation. Rodriguez stood over her again, but this time his expression was different. There was still determination in his eyes, but also something that might have been concern. He had pushed harder than he had initially intended, responding to Sarah's refusal to submit with increasing intensity. The lesson was becoming something more than he had planned, and he needed to carefully consider how to proceed. "That's enough, Martinez," Rodriguez said, his voice softer than before. "You've proven your point. Stay down." But even as the words left his mouth, Rodriguez could see in Sarah's eyes that she wasn't going to comply. Despite the pain, despite the overwhelming disparity in their skills and experience, despite every rational reason to submit, Sarah was already preparing to get back up. Her determination was visible in the set of her jaw and the fire that still burned in her eyes. The other drill instructors exchanged glances, recognizing that the situation was evolving beyond normal training parameters. What had started as a controlled lesson was becoming something that could potentially result in serious injury, if not carefully managed. Rodriguez saw their concern and knew he was approaching a decision point that would define not just this moment, but Sarah's entire future as a Marine recruit. Sarah pushed herself up more slowly this time, her body protesting the abuse it had endured. Sand clung to her torn uniform, and she could feel wetness where scrapes had begun to bleed. But her eyes never left Rodriguez's face, and her voice remained steady as she spoke. "Sir, this recruit is still not finished. Sir." The words carried a weight that made every person in the training area understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Sarah wasn't just refusing to quit. She was demonstrating a type of courage and determination that went beyond physical toughness into something that touched the very essence of what it meant to be a Marine. Rodriguez stared at Sarah for a long moment, his expression cycling through surprise, respect, and something that might have been pride. In 15 years as a drill instructor, he had seen thousands of recruits face moments of truth, but very few had responded to overwhelming adversity with the type of unbreakable determination that Sarah was displaying. Her refusal to stay down was forcing him to reconsider not just this lesson, but his entire assessment of her character. The watching recruits stood frozen in formation, afraid to move or speak as they witnessed something that was clearly beyond their normal training experience. Some looked terrified, others fascinated, but all of them understood that they were seeing something that would become legend among future classes of recruits. The air seemed charged with electricity as Rodriguez considered his next move. "Martinez," Rodriguez said slowly, his voice carrying a tone that none of the recruits had heard before. "Do you understand what you're doing? Do you understand that continuing this confrontation could result in serious injury? Do you understand that sometimes the strongest thing a Marine can do is know when to stop fighting?" Sarah wiped blood from her split lip with the back of her hand, leaving a red smear on her dirty uniform. Her shoulder throbbed where she had landed, and she was fairly certain that several of her ribs were bruised from the impacts. But none of the physical pain compared to the fire burning in her chest, the absolute refusal to be broken that had become the defining characteristic of this moment. "Sir, this recruit understands the risks, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her injuries. "But this recruit also understands that Marines don't abandon their fellow Marines, and this recruit won't abandon herself, sir." The words hit Rodriguez with unexpected force. Sarah wasn't just demonstrating physical courage. She was articulating a philosophy about what it meant to be a Marine that went to the very core of the Corps' values. Her refusal to quit wasn't about ego or proving a point. It was about a fundamental understanding of what honor and commitment really meant. Rodriguez looked around at the other drill instructors, seeing in their faces the same recognition that was growing in his own mind. They had all seen recruits who were physically tough, mentally strong, or technically proficient, but rarely had they encountered someone who embodied the intangible qualities that separated true Marines from those who simply wore the uniform. The senior drill instructor, Gunnery Sergeant Williams, stepped forward from where he had been observing the confrontation. Williams was a legend at Paris Island, a man whose 30-year career had seen him through multiple combat deployments and hundreds of recruit training cycles. His presence immediately changed the dynamic of the situation, adding weight and authority that even Rodriguez respected. "Stand fast, everyone," Williams commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had earned respect through decades of exemplary service. The entire training area fell silent except for the distant sounds of other platoons conducting their own training evolutions. Williams approached Sarah and Rodriguez with measured steps, his experienced eyes taking in the details of the confrontation and its aftermath. He could see Sarah's injuries, the determination still burning in her eyes, and the complex mixture of emotions playing across Rodriguez's face. This was clearly a situation that required careful handling to ensure the right lessons were learned by everyone involved. "Martinez," William said, stopping directly in front of Sarah. "Look at me." Sarah shifted her attention to the senior drill instructor, maintaining military bearing despite her disheveled appearance and obvious pain. William studied her face carefully, looking for signs of the mindset that was driving her refusal to submit. What he saw confirmed what he had observed throughout the confrontation. "Do you know why Staff Sergeant Rodriguez engaged you in this confrontation?" Williams asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the deeper purposes behind drill instructor methods. Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. The weeks of training had taught her that drill instructor questions were rarely as simple as they appeared, and Williams's involvement suggested that this moment had significance beyond what she had initially understood. "Sir, this recruit believes it was to teach a lesson about knowing when to quit." "Sir," Sarah replied. Williams nodded slowly. "Partially correct. But there's more to it than that. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has been testing you, Martinez, not just your physical capabilities or your technical skills, but something much more important. He's been testing your character, your commitment, and your understanding of what it really means to be a Marine." The senior drill instructor turned to address the entire platoon, his voice carrying clearly across the training area. "What you've witnessed here today is not about violence or proving who's tougher. What you've witnessed is a demonstration of the type of spirit that has made the Marine Corps legendary for over 200 years. Williams paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Martinez here has just demonstrated that she possesses something that can't be taught, something that exists at the very core of every great Marine. She has shown you what it looks like to refuse defeat even when defeat seems inevitable. She has shown you what it means to get back up every time you get knocked down." Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression now clearly showing the respect and admiration he had developed for Sarah throughout their confrontation. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying none of the harsh edge that had characterized their previous interactions. "Do you understand what you've accomplished here today?" Sarah looked between Rodriguez and Williams, still processing the shift in tone and trying to understand how her refusal to stay down had apparently transformed from defiance into something that was being praised. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving her aware of every ache and pain in her battered body. "Sir, this recruit is not sure she understands, sir," Sarah admitted honestly. Rodriguez smiled, the first genuine smile any of the recruits had ever seen from him. "What you've accomplished, Martinez, is proving that you have the heart of a Marine. You've shown that you understand that being a Marine isn't about being the fastest or the strongest or the smartest. Being a Marine is about having the courage to keep fighting when everything tells you to quit. It's about refusing to abandon your principles even when the cost is high." Williams nodded his agreement. "Every Marine who has ever worn the uniform has faced moments when quitting would have been easier, safer, and more comfortable. The Marines who become legends are the ones who refuse to quit even when quitting makes perfect sense. That's what you've demonstrated here today." The watching recruits began to understand that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that went beyond normal training and touched the very essence of what made the Marine Corps special. Sarah's refusal to stay down had become a demonstration of the type of character that drill instructors spent months trying to develop in their recruits. Rodriguez extended his hand to Sarah, offering assistance for the first time since their confrontation had begun. "Outstanding Marine," he said, using the title that none of the recruits had yet earned. "Absolutely outstanding." The aftermath of the confrontation rippled through 3rd Platoon, and eventually throughout all of Paris Island like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Word spread quickly among the drill instructors about the recruit who had refused to stay down, who had demonstrated the type of unbreakable spirit that defined the very best Marines. Sarah found herself transformed from someone who attracted negative attention to someone who had earned genuine respect through her actions rather than her words. The medical corpsman who treated Sarah's injuries was amazed by her condition. Despite the intensity of the confrontation, she had sustained only minor cuts, bruises, and scrapes that would heal quickly without lasting effects. More importantly, her spirit remained unbroken, her determination actually strengthened by the experience she had endured. The corpsman, a veteran of multiple deployments, recognized the look in her eyes as something he had seen in Marines who had proven themselves under the most challenging circumstances. Rodriguez's entire approach to training, Sarah changed dramatically after that day. The constant scrutiny and criticism were replaced by mentorship and guidance designed to help her develop into the leader he now recognized she could become. Their interactions became teaching moments rather than confrontations, with Rodriguez sharing insights from his own experience to help Sarah understand the deeper aspects of Marine Corps, leadership and values. The other recruits in 3rd Platoon initially weren't sure how to respond to Sarah's new status. Some felt resentful that she had apparently earned special treatment through what they saw as defiance, while others began to look up to her as an example of what was possible when someone refused to accept defeat. Sarah navigated these complex dynamics carefully, using her experience to help struggling recruits, rather than allowing it to separate her from her peers. Gunnery Sergeant Williams took a personal interest in Sarah's development, recognizing that she possessed the rare combination of physical capability, mental toughness, and moral courage that marked someone destined for significant leadership roles in the Corps. He began including her in advanced training opportunities and exposing her to concepts that wouldn't normally be covered until much later in a Marines development. The story of Sarah's confrontation with Rodriguez became part of Parris Island folklore, passed down from drill instructor to drill instructor and shared with new classes of recruits as an example of what the Corps was looking for in its Marines. Details were sometimes embellished in the retelling, but the core message remained constant. True Marines refused to quit even when quitting would be easier, safer, and more comfortable. Sarah's remaining weeks at Parris Island passed in a blur of increasingly challenging training that pushed her and her fellow recruits to their absolute limits. The difference was that Sarah now understood the purpose behind the challenges in a way she hadn't before. Every obstacle was an opportunity to demonstrate the type of character that had been revealed during her confrontation with Rodriguez. Every moment of adversity a chance to prove that she belonged among the ranks of Marines. The Crucible, the final test that separated recruits from Marines, came toward the end of their training cycle. 54 hours of continuous challenges designed to test everything they had learned about themselves and each other, culminating in a ceremony that would officially welcome them into the Corps. Sarah approached the Crucible with confidence born not from arrogance, but from deep knowledge of her own capabilities and limitations. During the Crucible, Sarah found herself naturally taking leadership roles when situations demanded it, but she also learned to follow when others were better suited to lead. The lesson Rodriguez had tried to teach her about teamwork and unit cohesion finally crystallized as she worked with her fellow recruits to overcome challenges that no individual could handle alone. When the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor were finally presented to the new Marines of 3rd Platoon, Sarah felt the weight of the emblem in her hands like a physical representation of everything she had endured and overcome. Rodriguez was the one who presented her with the symbol, and the pride in his eyes was unmistakable as he shook her hand and welcomed her to the Corps. The graduation ceremony was attended by families who had traveled from across the country to witness their sons and daughters officially become Marines. Sarah's parents sat in the front row, their faces glowing with pride as they watched their daughter receive recognition for her exceptional performance throughout training. Her father, the Army veteran who had first inspired her love of military service, had tears in his eyes as he watched Sarah receive awards for leadership, physical fitness, and overall excellence. After graduation, Sarah was selected for advanced training that would prepare her for leadership roles within the Corps. Her reputation from Parris Island had preceded her, and instructors at her next duty station were eager to work with someone who had already demonstrated the type of character they spent months trying to develop in new Marines. Years later, when Sarah had become a seasoned Marine with her own combat experience and leadership responsibilities, she would often think back to that moment on the training ground, when Rodriguez had knocked her down and she had made the decision to get back up. That single choice, made in a moment of pain and adversity, had defined not just her experience at Parris Island, but her entire understanding of what it meant to be a Marine. She would eventually become a drill instructor herself, passing on the lessons she had learned to new generations of recruits. When she encountered young men and women who showed promise but lacked the final spark of understanding about what true strength meant, she would share her own story about the day she learned that Marines don't quit, not because they're never knocked down, but because they always get back up. The lesson Rodriguez had tried to teach her through their confrontation became the foundation of her own leadership philosophy. That true strength isn't about individual excellence, but about the courage to keep fighting for something bigger than yourself, even when the odds seem impossible and the cost appears too high to pay. In the end, Sarah's refusal to stay down had transformed her from a talented recruit into a true Marine, someone worthy of the title and the traditions it represented.